The door didn't slam, it closed quietly, and somehow that made it worse. Inside, the room was already filling with people who mattered. Outside, she stood alone, holding a folder no one had asked to see. No badge checked twice. No name confirmed. Just a simple decision, not on the list. And that was enough to leave her behind. If you've ever been left out of something you were meant to be part of, type "left out" below. The forward command post had the compressed, electric quality of a space that knows it doesn't have long. Temporary by design, but serious in every other way, maps already spread across the central table, screens pulling in data feeds from multiple sources, personnel moving through the narrow corridors between equipment with the focused, shoulder-width efficiency of people who have stopped conserving effort and started spending it. An emergency briefing was about to begin. The kind where the people in the room would determine the shape of what happened next, and the people outside it would simply receive the result. The list had been confirmed before anyone arrived. That was standard. In environments where information is classified and access is controlled, the list is not a formality, it is the mechanism. It tells the guard at the door who is cleared to be present, and the guard's job is clean and simple. If the name is there, the door opens. If it isn't, it doesn't. The protocol exists for good reasons, and it works precisely because it doesn't bend. She arrived with a folder. Around 35, dressed practically nothing that immediately communicated rank or role in the way that full dress uniform does. She walked with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had made this kind of approach before, who understood the environment she was entering and wasn't performing urgency for an audience. The folder under her arm was worn at the edges, used, not ornamental. The guard checked the list. He was thorough, careful, the way a person is careful when they understand that the job they've been given matters. He went through the names once, then again. He looked up at her, not unkindly, and delivered the result in the neutral, impersonal tone of someone executing a process rather than making a personal judgment. Her name wasn't there. The protocol was clear. She didn't argue. She didn't move closer to the list to look for herself, or reach for credentials she expected would change the outcome, or explain who she was in the expectant tone of someone confident that the explanation would resolve things. She absorbed the result with a kind of steadiness that had nothing defensive in it, just the particular composure of someone who has encountered friction between process and reality before. She nodded, once, stepped to the side, the door closed. Nobody looked back at her. The personnel who passed her on their way in registered her the way you register someone who is adjacent to a situation without being part of it, present, noted, categorized as not relevant. Someone who had come to the wrong place, or hadn't been important enough to make the final cut. The interpretation assembled itself without effort, because the situation seemed to support it completely. She didn't leave. She stood beside the entrance, not blocking it, not hovering over it, not in any posture that communicated impatience or grievance or the restless energy of someone waiting for an injustice to be corrected. She simply stood there, holding the folder. As if she already knew something the door didn't. Inside, the briefing began to assemble itself. The map on the central table showed the operational area in full terrain, positions, movement corridors, all the physical data that the situation required. The screens alongside it fed in the supporting information, signals, timing, resource availability, the layered technical picture that transforms a map from a drawing into a decision-making tool. The people in the room were qualified. They had been selected for this meeting specifically because their presence was considered necessary, and they moved into their roles with the brisk confidence of professionals who understood the stakes. The conversation started, and almost immediately, something didn't fit. It wasn't a loud problem. That was the thing about it. There was no moment where someone raised a hand and announced that the information was incomplete, no obvious point of failure that interrupted the flow. The meeting continued moving forward the way meetings do when momentum is expected of them, when everyone in the room is operating under the assumption that the necessary pieces are present and the gaps just need to be identified and closed. But the gaps weren't closing. One officer laid out the primary approach. It was logical, well-structured, built on the data available. And it was missing something, not dramatically, not in a way that made the entire framework collapse, but in the way that a load-bearing element missing from an otherwise complete structure eventually makes itself known. The approach reached a certain point and stopped being definitive. The conclusion wanted to be certain and couldn't quite get there. Another officer pushed back. Also logical, also built on solid ground. Also stopping just short of the clarity the situation required, reaching for a level of confidence in the analysis that the available data didn't fully support. The room had enough to have a conversation. It didn't have enough to make a decision. The biggest problems aren't the loud ones, they're the ones no one realizes are missing something. If you've ever seen a situation feel off without knowing why, type "something's missing" below. Outside, she hadn't moved. She wasn't watching the door or the people passing through it. She was simply present, holding the folder with the patience of someone who has placed their situation in the hands of time and is content to let time do its work. Not passive, not resigned. Something quieter and more certain than either of those things. Like she had been here before. Not this room, not this exact situation, but this particular position. On the outside of a process that needed something it didn't know it was missing. Inside, a senior officer paused in the middle of a sentence. Not because he'd lost his place. Because something in the shape of what he was constructing had produced, for just a moment, the uncomfortable clarity of a person recognizing that the building they're in may not have all its walls. He looked at the data on the screen. He looked at the gap in it. He didn't say anything yet, but the meeting, which had been moving with forced momentum, lost a beat. And in the silence of that lost beat, the room was as close as it had come to admitting what had been true since the door closed. The meeting hadn't really started, because the piece it needed most was still standing outside. The general arrived without advance signal. He came through the outer corridor with the unhurried authority of someone who has long since stopped needing to demonstrate importance through pace or posture, moving at a speed that served him, not one designed to perform urgency for observers. The guard at the door straightened. The entrance was prepared. The room beyond it was waiting, as rooms wait for the person whose presence officially begins what has only been approximating a meeting in their absence. He reached the threshold, and he stopped. Not the brief, transitional pause of someone stepping from one environment into another. A real stop, the kind that carries deliberate weight, that causes the guard to glance up, that creates a small but distinct interruption in the forward momentum that everyone had been anticipating. He looked into the room. Then he turned and looked back past the guard, past the small corridor of people and equipment, to where she was standing beside the entrance with her folder and her composure, and her particular quality of waiting that looked different from the outside, now, than it had before he appeared. The look he gave the room lasted less than a second. The look he gave her lasted longer. Not searching, there was nothing uncertain in it. It was the look of someone doing a specific check and receiving a specific result. The way you look at a seat that should be occupied when you need to know whether it is. He said, "Where is she?" 3 words. No title, no descriptor, no additional information that would help anyone who didn't already know exactly who he meant. The guard processed it with the visible effort of someone whose certainty has just been structurally complicated. He understood his role. He had executed it correctly, by every available measure. The list had been the list, and the list had not included her, and that had been the operative fact for the past however many minutes. But the general was not asking him to justify the protocol. He was asking where she was. One of the officers inside the room, a woman standing close enough to the threshold to have heard the exchange, clearly went still in the way people go still when a delayed realization arrives with full force. She looked toward the entrance. She looked back at the table. She looked at the gap in the analysis that had been silently frustrating the room for the past 30 minutes and understood, in approximately 2 seconds, exactly what the gap was and why it was there. The general didn't step into the room. The door stayed open. The entire assembled briefing, the maps, the screens, the officers, the process that had been building toward a decision sat in suspension, waiting for a forward movement that wasn't going to happen yet, because the person who had convened it was standing at the threshold without crossing it, and the reason was standing a short distance away, holding a worn folder, watching none of this with any visible urgency. Someone came to get her. Not with ceremony, just the practical direct motion of someone correcting an error that needed to be corrected now. She was asked to come in. She accepted with the same quiet composure she had brought to being turned away, which was to say, without drama, without the pause of someone savoring a reversal, without any performance of what the moment might have entitled her to perform. She walked through the door. The room shifted the instant she entered, not loudly, not with any visible reorganization, but in the specific way a room shifts when the element it's been arranged around finally arrives. Conversations that had been spinning without resolution stopped, not because anyone called them to stop, but because the need for them had suddenly resolved. She placed the folder on the table. She opened it without preamble. And the thing that had been missing from every analysis, every approach, every framework the room had been attempting to build appeared. The data fit. The gaps closed. The conclusion that had been refusing to come into focus came into focus. Not because she was more capable than everyone else in the room, because she was the piece the room had been built around without knowing it, and without her. The structure had been weight-bearing nothing. The briefing began in earnest within minutes. The pace that had been stalling, circling, unable to commit it, found its footing almost immediately. Decisions that had been resisting resolution moved through the room with the clean efficiency of a process that finally has everything it needs. The work continued the way good work continues when the conditions for it are correct. With focus, with precision, and with the particular quality of momentum that comes from knowing the ground beneath you is solid. Nobody referenced what had happened at the door. There was no moment of acknowledgement, no formal recognition of the mistake that had been made and corrected, no space created for the kind of institutional accounting that might satisfy an observer who was looking for one. The meeting moved forward. That was the priority, and the people in the room understood priorities. The guard stood at his post through all of it. He was not reprimanded. Nobody came to find him at the door and explain what he had failed to understand, how the woman he had turned away, correctly and by the book, had been the central figure of the entire operation, present in a capacity that the list's compilers had somehow failed to capture. He stood with the particular stillness of someone who has added a piece of information to their understanding of how the world works in a way that cannot be unfiled. That was its own kind of lesson, not a punishment, a correction of the mental model. The list is the mechanism. The list is not infallible. And the gap between those two facts is the space where consequential mistakes live, quiet and invisible, right up until the moment they aren't. When it was over, she closed the folder. She gathered her things without lingering the same economy of movement that had characterized everything she'd done since arriving. She didn't stay for the conversations that tend to follow high-pressure meetings. The informal exchanges where relationships solidify and credit is quietly distributed. The general watched her go. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The quality of the attention he gave her departure carried everything: the recognition, the respect, the specific weight of someone acknowledging a debt that exists between people who have shared a context that most others haven't. She walked out through the door. This time, it opened before she reached it. Not every important person looks like they belong, and not every list includes the ones who matter most. The real mistake isn't leaving someone out. It's realizing too late that everything depended on them. Subscribe to Steel Heart Stories Emma for more stories where the missing piece changes everything.